very brief introduction. Nobody needs much information about Thierry Nazzi. We all know him. He's a senior research scientist at the Baby Lab in KK, Integrative Neuroscience and Cognition Center at the CNRS and Université de Paris. And he's a leading scholar in the field of early language acquisition and a source of inspiration to many generations of scientists, some of them present here. His main interests are speech perception in infants, in lexical and in syntactic acquisition, a topic he has long been interested in and to which he has greatly contributed to is the differential role of consonants and vowels to the acquisition of new words, lexical access through reading, word recognition and lexical processing, and also how it varies across languages. Besides language acquisition in monolingual and bilingual infants, he has also long been interested in studying language acquisition in atypical populations, such as children with Williams syndrome, deaf children with cochlear implants, and premature infants. I'd like to thank Thierry for being with us in another edition of NeuroDWELL and sharing with us his knowledge and his most recent work, and not so recent as well. The title of his presentation today is Early Language Acquisition in Infants Born Preterm. Please join me in thanking Thierry Nazzi with a round of applause. Thank you.
Okay, do you hear me? Yeah. All right. So thank you very much for the nice, first for the invitation, and then for the very nice introduction. It always makes me smile when I hear things like that about me. As Marina said, I'm going to talk today about the work on infants born preterm, which is something that we started at this point maybe 15 years ago, and then there was a short break because of lack of students and funding, and so now we got a new grant this year, and so we're going to restart some of the things about it. So about preterm birth, we know that it's about 10% of infants are born preterm worldwide. You see on the right a map from the WHO about the estimated percentages of preterms around the world. And in France, it accounts for about 7% of births. There are different ways of being preterm, so there are different levels of prematurity that you can define differently, so in different ways. So you can use gestational age. So the more in advance you are born, the more severely preterm you are, and so you can distinguish extremely, very moderate, and late preterms. But there's also another factor that also matters much. It's the birth weight. So you can be low, very low, or extremely low in terms of weight. There are also potentially a lot of associated medical issues. Some are relatively benign, but some others are more severe. So you can have interventricular hemorrhage that can be light or very severe. So this will create a lot of variability across the preterm infants. In terms of language acquisition, there are many consequences of preterm birth that could impact language acquisition. The first one is the loss of prenatal auditory experience. So we know that the auditory system becomes functional in the last 3 months of pregnancy. And so if you are born early, you are going to lose that information. And that's going to have an impact on prenatal experience with prosodic information. Another consequence is that you are going to have earlier access to clear speech. And that means that you will start hearing segmental information earlier than usual. Of course, the brain system that's going to process this clear speech is going to be less mature at the beginning. And as I said, there might be more or less severe medical issues, some of them including the brain level, like brain lesions, that might affect areas involved in language acquisition. And finally, there's also those preterm infants, most of them are going to stay in the hospital for weeks or months, sometimes also like in incubators for a very long time. And so that's going to affect the early social and linguistic environment that they are going to start in life. So what we know about the effects of prematurity on children. So there are quite a few studies. So for example, we know that about 30% of extremely preterm infants have persistent language impairments. So so there's really like a risk on language acquisition. And studies on toddlerhood and childhood show that there are impairments at different linguistic levels. So the phonological, the lexical, and the morphosyntactic level. So basically like all the levels. And also like on both sides of language. So on the perception comprehension side, but also on the production side. And a finding that's also frequent is that there is a modulation of these impairments by the degree of prematurity. So the more severe you are preterm, the more likely you'll have difficulties. So however, most of these studies are based on indirect measures. So assessments by psychologists or speech therapists, questionnaires. And so what I'm going to briefly present is new data that we got on lexical and syntactic acquisition in the preschool years using an interactive self-administered test. And that's work that we started during COVID, where we were confined at home, and we were wondering, like, what could we do? And so we worked on adapting to French a test called QUILS that had been set up in the US for English by Roberta Golinkov and Kafi Spasek and their colleagues. So it's called QUILS in English. We called it TICOALA in French. We know that the English version of the test is sensitive to age, which is good for developmental test, but also to SES and parental education. So the test is testing 3 areas. So it's testing current knowledge of vocabulary. So by showing infants several vignettes, and then they hear a voice saying, can you show me the school teacher? And they have to touch on the screen, so on the touch screen, which image is the correct one. So that's for vocabulary. We're also testing grammar. So in this example, I think it says, who is feeding the baby? And so the good answer would be the lady. And then what's more, that's something that's in the QUILS, that's more original. It's the test of new word learning. So they will first see 4 images, the 4 images on the left, and they will hear the voice saying, can you show me the blue torba? So torba is not a word in French. And so the infant has to figure out that the torba is going to be these objects here. And then there's a second series of 4 images showing, can you show me the another torba? and then they have to extend to the green one now. We tested 1,000, so now we tested 1,200 children in schools from 3 to 7, but we only tested 114 preterms, and we matched them with full-term controls. And what we found is that if we compare the full-terms with all the preterms, we don't see any significant effect, so overall there is no delay. However, you can see that at 3 years, so in the younger age group, we see that the preterms are graphically below the full terms. So probably if we had more power, we would be able to see that the effect is significant. Another analysis we did was to compare the different levels of prematurity. So we separated the infants between moderate preterms, very preterms, and extremely preterms. And here we see that the extremely preterms are performing below the others. And it's significant on vocabulary and then the process measure, and it's marginal for syntax. So what our finding, so in a way we are replicating with our self-administered test that there is an impact of prematurity. Maybe not all preterms have difficulties, but at least the most preterms do seem to have language difficulties. So that was about COVID, but my main interest is on early language acquisition, and decades of research have established that language acquisition starts from birth, and even like in the last semester of pregnancy for some of prosodic acquisition. And so I was interested in looking at preterms for 2 reasons. One was to hopefully identify some factors that explain the later impairments that we see in childhood. And if we do that, then also be able to set up remediation that would be more efficient. So looking at early phonological acquisition in preterms, if we look at the literature, there are 3 main questions that have been addressed. One is what's the origin in infancy of the language delays found in childhood? Second one is are they effects of the degree of prematurity? And the last one is are there differential effects of prematurity on the early acquisition of different linguistic levels? And so here I made a review of studies on early prosodic and segmental acquisition. And what comes out of this literature is that if you look at prosody or vowel acquisition, we see that most of the studies show delays in the preterms compared to the full terms. At best, they will be at maturational level, meaning if you correct for the duration of their preterm prematurity, then they are at the same level as the full terms. However, when we look at consonantal information, the picture is, that we have for now, appears different, that it looks like the preterms are at postnatal age, or maybe sometimes at maturational level, but we don't see delays in acquisition, at least for now. So it looks like early prosodic and vocalic acquisition is more affected by prematurity, and early consonantal information is less affected by prematurity. So what could explain those differences? It could be that the loss of prenatal experience is going to impact more prosody and vocalic acquisition, and have less impact on consonantal acquisition. And so that's, like in the paper with Nayeli Gonzalez-Gomez, that's what we call the developmental asynchrony hypothesis. I don't know if it's the best term, now that I think about it again, but it's in the paper, so I thought I would still have to use it. But so then the idea is that depending on the domain and how it, how losing information in pregnancy is going to play a role, there are different effects that are going to be found. And so from these results, we decided to look at early language acquisition with the idea that since many aspects of lexical acquisition start after birth, maybe we should also see that this subdomain of acquisition is less affected by prematurity. And this is interesting because, as I said earlier, in childhood and toddlerhood, we see that some infants do have difficulties in lexical acquisition. So there are some delays in vocabulary development, and there's slower speed in processing of in lexical recognition. But we decided that to look at younger ages and see if we can see traces of these effects at those ages, or if we don't. And we're going to look at two phenomena. The first one is going to be word form segmentation, and we're going to look at around 6 and 8 months of age. And the second one is word form recognition, so I will explain both in more details. And so our prediction was that maybe those two subdomains are going to be less affected by prematurity than prosodic and vocalic processing. So I will start with word form segmentation, which is going to be the main part of my presentation. And so what is word form segmentation? So it is the question of how infants find words, or more precisely word forms, in fluent speech, given that when we speak to infants, we make most of the time sentences and we don't use words in isolation, and that the cues that are in there are cues in the signal, but those cues are not as clear as those that we put in writing when we put blanks between the words, at least in our writing systems. And so here I like to show this example of a sentence in French, which is made up of 7 or 8 words. And you see that the only blank in the signal in that sentence, that you might think, oh, that's a word boundary, there's a silence. It's in fact the silence that you had to do when you close the lip to produce the P of the word lapin. So it's a word internal silence, and that's the only silence in the sentence. So finding those word forms is a real issue, and in spite of being sounding so difficult, there is a lot of evidence now that speech segmentation emerges between 4 and 8 months in several languages. So I listed languages for which we have evidence, so English, French, Dutch, German, Dutch, but there's also, I should have put Portuguese. So many languages, so 5. And of course, we will try to forget that all those languages are Indo-Europeans, so which kind of limits the generalizability maybe of the results. But still, we see that, at least in some languages, those abilities emerge early. But how do infants find those word forms if there are no silences between the words? So there's a huge literature on this, and I'm not going to be able to talk about it, but here I listed some of the cues that have been identified. So the two most studied cues that are, I think, that people think are the most important, at least at the onset of segmentation abilities, are distributional and rhythmic cues. But then there are a lot of other cues that are also involved, so such as co-articulation, phonotactic information, allophonic information, pitch accent, major prosodic boundaries, the nature of the initial phoneme, and the presence of known words in the signal. But those other cues seem to start being used a bit later than the distributional and rhythmic cues. And so what we are going to, so before I move to the studies that we did, one slide about the importance of word segmentation, word form segmentation. So there are a few studies that show that it might have a crucial role in lexical acquisition. So there are some studies showing that it's related to later language acquisition. So infants with more mature segmentation skills subsequently have larger vocabularies, so it seems to help vocabulary lexical acquisition. There's a study, in our study we also showed that it's linked to production, so infants with more mature segmentation skills have more advanced production skills at the same time, at the same age. And there's also a link with input. We found that infants with more mature segmentation skills had received more input 4 months prior to testing. So what did we know about word segmentation abilities in preterm infants when we started working on this? There was one study published, a study on Spanish and Catalan 8-month-old infants by Bosch in 2011, where she had tested a group of full-term and a group of preterm infants on the segmentation of monosyllabic words, but with complex structures, so CVC and CCVC syllables. And she had found that the full terms could segment, but not the preterms. And the interpretation she had given was that maybe there was delayed segmentation in the preterms, but she also raised the possibility that maybe the failure was due to other things, so like cognitive load, or maybe the fact that she had used complex words. And so we took that as a call for replication, but I think it's always nice to have more than one study on one question. And we started to retest syllabic segmentation in French, our population, this time using the simplest and less marked syllable possible, so we use CV syllables. And the reason also for using CV syllables is that because we had evidence that there's an early emergence in French of the ability to segment those types of syllables, and also that the syllable is a basic unit for early speech processing, possibly like across languages. And so we thought that if they should be able to segment something, that should be this structure. So we started with an experiment on monosyllabic CV word segmentation, and we tested French learning 6-month-olds. And we tested 6-month-olds because we had evidence from prior study that full-term infants at that age can segment those CV syllables, those CV words. So our participants were preterms. We included 24 infants in the sample, and to test 24, to include 24, we had to exclude 19. So that will be my note 1, that there's a relatively high rejection rate in this experiment, and we'll see that in other experiments. And in that study, we managed to vary and kind of like balance relatively well the gestational age of the infants across the 4 different levels of prematurity. And we also have a range of birth weights. So that with the idea to look at the effects of those factors on performance. In terms of methods, so we use the same stimuli as the study in the Nishibayashi study in which we had tested full terms. Our target CV words are 4 infrequent words in French, so dipot, te, and gou. And infants, so we're using the head-turn preference procedure, which is a method to measure auditory processing in infants. And infants were first familiarized with what we call 2 passages, 2 stories, one for each of 2 different words. So let's see if the sound worked. I forgot to check.
Ses goûts exquis et savoureux me plaisent. L'enfant se régale au goût de la crème. Mon goût préféré est celui de la menthe. L'alimentation varie selon les goûts de chacun. Nos goûts favoris sont le citron et le café. Au fur et à mesure, mes goûts évoluent.
Okay, so maybe you heard the passage. Oh, sorry. So then there's a lot of words in those passages, but then there's one word that is repeated in every sentence. And after that, they will hear isolated repetitions of those 2 words or 2 different words. And I'm not going to play the sound. So what did we find? So we found that there's a significant segmentation in both the full terms that we had tested earlier and the preterms that we tested in this study with, in both cases, with familiarity effects, so they prefer listening to what they recognize. And there's no, I didn't write that, but there's no interaction between groups, so the effect is of the same magnitude in both groups. In the preterms, we also looked at whether the difference score, which is a measure of the size of the effect is related to gestational age and birth weight, and we didn't see any significant correlation. So what this first experiment shows is early segmentation ability of monosyllabic CV words at 6 months postnatal age, so we're testing them without correcting age, which means that on average those infants were 4 months in terms of maturational age. So then we wanted to know if they were at postnatal or maturational age. To do that, we tested a group of full terms at 4 months to see whether they did segment or not at that age. If they had not segmented, it would have told that the preterms were at postnatal age. Unfortunately, in a sense, the full terms at 4 months also segmented the words. So then it leaves the question open of whether the preterms are at maturational or postnatal age. To answer this question, now we would need to test another group of preterms at 4 months, which we have not been able to do now, but we'll try to do that at some point. So our findings are different from the results from BOSC 2011, and what could account for those differences? Maybe it's in the stimuli. Maybe our task was set up in slightly different ways that made it easier for our preterms to do the task. We also like testing in a different language, and also like in a different country. So maybe the way the infants are what's the word? Are taken care in the medical system is different, and that has an impact on development. So we don't know that. The second point is that we did not find in the correlation analysis that performance is modulated by prematurity level. But as I mentioned, there's a high rejection rate. And if we look at the gestational ages and birth weights of the infants who were rejected, we see that they are slightly more preterm than those who were included. So maybe the effect is in the rejection rate and not in the correlation. But those differences were only, there were tendencies, so we have to be careful still about what we can conclude. So now what we wanted to do is to test possible limits on preterm segmentation abilities. And to do that, we did two follow-up studies. The first one is we knew from the work on fullterms that monosyllabic CV words are easier to segment than CV syllables who are embedded in bisyllabic words at 6 months. And so then what we did in our second experiment was to test the preterms on those embedded syllables. And the second study I'm going to present is a study on bilingual infants. So we had evidence that monosyllabic fullterms and now preterms can segment words, but we didn't know if that would extend to bilinguals. And the studies in the literature show that there are slight differences in how segmentation abilities start in bilinguals. So we were interested in that issue, also because we're working with a hospital that receives a lot of immigrant families. So there was a demand also from the hospital to look at that population. So about the segmentation of embedded CV syllables, again we tested 6-month-olds. And compared to monosyllabic words, there are reduced prosodic and co-articulation cues to syllable boundaries for embedded syllables. And as a result, we had found that the segmentation of embedded syllables, although it is found at 6 months, it requires, it is a bit more difficult, it requires a longer familiarization with the stimuli. So we decided to replicate the experiment we had conducted with the full-term infants. Again, we included 24 preterm infants. And to do so, we had to, again, reject the data of 17 infants. And this time, so the passages, the same 4 syllables, tipo, te, and gu, came where the initial or final syllables of 8 different words in the passages. So here the words for di are dîner, caddie, disin, bandit, divan, taudis, dito, and radis. And so let's see how it works with cable.
Le dîner mondain m'ennuie horriblement. Leurs caddies contiennent beaucoup de denrées. Il y a écrit un disin romantique. Il vient d'arrêter 5 bandits dangereux. Tes 2 divans rouges sont très confortables. Votre cosy vient d'être découvert. L'homme doit écouter le dito moralisant. J'aime manger ces omadis salés.
Okay. So again, we familiarize with 2 passages, and then we're testing the isolated syllables. And what we found is, again, a significant segmentation in both the preterm and the full-term groups. But what we find is a reversal of the direction of the effect in the preterms, where we find a preference for the control, so for the syllables that they didn't hear during familiarization. When we look at whether this effect is modulated by prematurity, we do correlations, and again, we don't find significant correlations with gestational age and birth weight. So we find that the preterms can segment those more complex embedded syllables, but we see a novelty effect rather than a familiarity effect, which may point to processing difficulties. Although, if we think about it in the framework of the Hunter and Ames model, it doesn't really make sense because it would suggests that the task was easier for the preterms than the fullterms. Well, maybe it is, but it's just like maybe not what we would have predicted. Another possibility is that they are using different underlying cognitive mechanisms that then give a different effect. So it's still a very puzzling finding, and we are right now we went back to like trying and write the paper, and we are in the process of trying to find like explanations to this effect. But so what this reversal of the effect suggests is that even though we find that they can segment those more complex syllables, still the results suggest that the segmentation abilities might partly differ between the preterm and the fullterm infants. The last experiment on segmentation looked at whether those abilities extend to bilingual infants. And we're going to go back to the segmentation of the CV monosyllabic words. In the literature, there were like several studies that had looked at segmentation abilities in bilingual infants. Some of them testing the segmentation of monosyllabic words in Singapore English Mandarin bilinguals. And that study found that at 7.5 months, they can segment in both languages. There was a study also on Spanish Catalan infants at 6 months showing that they can segment in the dominant language, and they had not tested the non-dominant language. And finally, there were studies on French-English bilinguals using bisyllabic words. It's a very complex pattern of results, but basically what they found is that at 8 months, in the first study, they found that the bilinguals are segmenting in French, but not in English, with no effect of dominance. And then they also tested 8 and 10-month-olds in a different study with a slightly different method. And here they find that they discriminate in both the dominant and the non-dominant language, independently of what language it is exactly. But there are some complex modulation in the results. So still those findings suggest that there are segmentation abilities in bilingual infants. And note that the bilingual infants in all of those studies were tested in bilingual or multilingual societies. So societies where the 2 languages tested were spoken in the society in general. Here we are going to test infants in a different situation. So we're going to test how bilinguals grow up in a monolingual society where if you go out of your apartment, people speak French, and they also like a lot of them like only speak French. And so that might have like a different impact on the way like infants are learning their 2 languages. And so our bilinguals are going to be tested on French monosyllabic words, and they are all here French in their environment. And the second language they hear is going to be very varied as a reflection of all the languages that are spoken in different families in Paris and its area. Our predictions were that the fullterms, we predict that they should segment based on the previous studies, even though here they are growing up in a monolingual society. And we were also interested in the effect of language balance, which was not clear from the other studies, but still that needed some more evidence. Further preterms, so we saw that the monolinguals can do this task. And so then the outcome would depend on the interaction between prematurity and bilingualism. Again, so we tested 24 French other language fullterms at 6 months and 19 French other language preterms at the same age. We again excluded more infants than often. And here I plotted the list of all the languages that were spoken in the families of our bilinguals. You might not see very well, but just to show that there's a lot of variability in the other languages. So the experiment is the same as the first one I presented. What did we find? So if we look first at the results of the bilinguals, we see that there's again a segmentation, significant segmentation with no difference between the groups. So both the bilingual full term and the bilingual preterms segment the words. For the preterms, we don't find a correlation between the different score and gestational age, but we find a correlation with their birth weights. So that's the first time that we find an effect of prematurity level. And for the bilinguals, we don't find an effect of language balance. When we compare the results of those bilinguals with the results of the monolinguals that we got earlier, for both the full terms and the preterms, what we find is a significant segmentation because all the groups segmented, but we also find a marginal familiarity by language interaction, which means that there's a slightly stronger segmentation in the monolinguals, so we see a small effect of bilingualism. And in terms of prematurity, we don't find that segmentation is modulated, but we find that overall the preterms are orienting longer to the lights, to the sounds, than the full terms. And again, we don't find correlation between different score and prematurity measures. So I think I should accelerate. So in terms of discussion or summary, so we found an extension of segmentation abilities to bilingual infants growing up in a monolingual society. The effect is slightly reduced. Our infants did hear about like 50 to 75% of French input. So this suggests that's enough to elicit segmentation skills at 6 months of age. We did not find an effect of language balance, but we would need to test other linguistic profiles. In particular, like all of our infants heard French more than the other language, so we should try and test infants who receive less French input than the other language. In terms of methodology, I just wanted to highlight that we could observe segmentation skills in French even though we included infants from diverse linguistic backgrounds. So if you are doing research in a place where you have access to bilinguals but you don't have a homogeneous populations, sometimes you can set up some experiments where it makes sense to put all the bilinguals together. At the same time, what we would like to do in the future is to test the effects of linguistic distance. So maybe separate infants according to the linguistic difference between their two languages to see how it impacts their segmentation ability. And in terms of prematurity, we didn't find a difference between the segmentation abilities of the full terms and the preterms. And here it is interesting to note that we didn't find an effect, even though most of the preterms that we tested in this experiment were very to extreme preterms, which is the population that is usually more at risk of developmental problems. So overall, we found segmentation abilities for monosyllables and embedded syllables in place at least by 6 months postnatal age, so not corrected but for prematurity. So showing that there are basic core mechanisms that are in place for segmentation in this population. And this ability seems robust as it we didn't find strong effects of bilingualism or prematurity. Why do we find such strong effects? It might be due to the fact that we tested monosyllabic CV syllables, which are the default processing unit and the rhythmic unit of French. So we put ourselves in the easiest possible conditions according to our theoretical assumptions. So about the lack of strong effect of prematurity level, what I would like still to highlight is that we did find some differences in preterms segmentation abilities compared to the full terms. So that's the reversal of the effect in the embedded syllable experiment. And I also highlighted several times the high dropout rates. So we should be careful before we say that they are doing it just the same as the full-term infants. And follow-ups that we are planning would be to extend the work to test further word structures that would be more complex. To also test other segmentation cues. So I told you about all the cues at the beginning of the talk. So we didn't really start to look at those things in more detail. And so it could be that some of those segmentation cues, depending on their nature, are going to be more or less affected by prematurity. So that was all about word segmentation. So very quickly, I will present a study, an experiment on word form recognition. So we know that lexical acquisition starts in the first year of life. And how do we know that? There are some studies that show that by 5 months, infants have an auditory recognition of, for example, their own name. But also that they comprehend a few words, such as, for example, mommy and daddy, or foot and hand. And then we know that by 10 to 11 months of age, they start to have an auditory recognition of familiar word forms. So if you present them with words they should know and words that they should not know, they're going to listen longer to the words they should know. So what about the preterms? So we are in the process of testing a group of preterms on this issue. So we already have tested 20 infants at 11 months. But one thing that we have in this experiment, we have a lot of late preterms. So we are going to continue to test to add more premature infants. We replicating a study that we did with Sylvana Poltrock, where we showed that full-term 11-month-olds have a preference for words over pseudo words. So we're giving them 10 familiar words and 10 pseudo words. And what we found is a significant recognition effect that's attested by the familiarity in both groups. So they prefer listening to the words they know. And again, when we look at whether performance in the preterms is modulated by prematurity levels, we don't see any effects. So again, in this experiment that's not completely finished, we see that there's a recognition of frequent word forms at 11 months, so the same age as we find the effect in full-term infants. So again, pointing to the presence of basic mechanisms. We don't find effects of prematurity level, but in this sample of infants, for now, we mostly have late preterms, so that's maybe why we don't see effects of prematurity levels. So we're adding we're testing more infants to include other groups of preterms. And among the follow-ups that we are planning will be to test the extension of, do they recognize more words than those 10 words we're testing, but also what is the format of these early word forms? Are they sensitive to mispronunciations of these word forms? And that's linked to my work on the processing of consonants and vowels in lexical acquisition. So to wrap up, what I showed you is that there is evidence of delays and impairments in language acquisition in children born preterm, and so that's confirmed to some degree with our TICOALA study, where we found that the younger infants, the 3-year-olds, tend to have like a lower performance, and also like the children with who are born extremely preterm. And I raised like 3 questions about preterm infants. So going back to the first one, so the origins in infancy of language delays in childhood. So what we found is the presence of basic core abilities in place for word form segmentation and word form recognition. So we didn't find strong evidence of delays. So in a way, that's encouraging for this population of infants. Although for our point of view of the research, it means that we didn't find explanations for the later delays that some of those children are going to have in lexical development, which means that we have more work to do. Yet, as I said, we found some differences. So, for example, for the segmentation of the embedded syllables. So that means that we need to do more things. So we'll be testing more complex structures, the use of other cues, the phonological details of the word form representations. And we should also keep in mind that the later impairments that we see in the preterms might not come solely from auditory processing, but they might come from other linguistic levels. So maybe in the acquisition of morphosyntax, there are some difficulties that we're not capturing in our experiments. And also in the integration of the word forms, so the auditory patterns with the meaning. Maybe that's also where preterms will have more difficulties than fullterms. About the effects of the degree of prematurity, we did not find strong effects in our studies. Why not? It could be due to sample sizes. So we have 24 infants. That's not so bad because it's not an easy population to test, but still it's not a huge sample size. But maybe also another difficulty is that there's important and multidimensional group variability. So those infants differ by gestational age, but also birth weight, but also medical issues, but also medical support. So some of them have speech therapy or not, different kind of speech therapies. And all those factors are not necessarily correlated, so then it makes a very complex variability to capture. Yeah. About the third point, about the differential effects of prematurity on the acquisition of different linguistic levels. So I had mentioned that it looks like prosodic and vocalic acquisition is more affected than consonantal acquisition. And if we add our results on early word form processing, in our results we find that the infants are either at postnatal or maturational age. So this domain would also fall into the less affected domain. 2 last slides, I think. So maybe difficulties, which I think, in research on preterm infants. So it's about preterms, but I think it's more general about when you're looking at infants with atypical development, is that there are difficulties in recruitment. So those infants are relatively rare in frequency. So particularly like for the extreme or very preterm. So it will be a lot of work to find them. Also, like when there are medical issues involved, that means that families won't necessarily be able to bring the infants. And there are also some SES factors that I haven't talked about, but we know that SES affects prematurity levels. So that's going to have like limitations on sample size, but also like testing biases. I mentioned the important multidimensional group variability that makes it difficult to isolate effects of various factors. and about the increased rejection rate. So we are rejecting about 65% of preterms compared to usually 25% when we're testing full terms. So we should further test whether there's a link between the prematurity levels of the infants and their rejection rate. But the rejection could also follow motor difficulties, and maybe so we should try and use other techniques to test them. So, for example, central fixation or EEG. I'm not sure it would help, but maybe it would. And there could also be differences in attention or audiovisual processing in preterms that explains those rejection rates. Still, it is important to test those populations. There's a direct interest for these populations to better understand the potential deficits that they have, what linguistic levels, what mechanisms are potentially affected, what is their developmental trajectory, and can we do an early diagnosis of their problems. And ultimately, hopefully it will lead to better remediation. And I think something that's important also to note is that parents feel that it's very important research, so they can be very involved in participating, so it's a very rewarding work. And theoretically, I think it also raises questions about human variability and its limits, and it can help you test hypotheses proposed on the basis of a typical development, although you have to be careful that you can have atypical trajectories. And I will stop. I thank all my collaborators, the funding, you all, the organizers, and I'm done.